Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. In November of last year I set myself a little challenge. I wanted to create a series of videos covering the Darkstalkers franchise, with each upload being shot in a different country. Most of the characters in these games are based off of different myths and monsters from various corners of the globe, so I felt it would be fun to give these videos somewhat of an international feel. I covered the first game from Rasnov Citadel in Transylvania, Romania, and today we return to Eastern Europe, this time visiting Vajunjad Castle, located in Budapest, Hungary. Although this castle looks much older, it was actually designed by a gentleman known as Ignác Alpa as recently as just the 19th century, with the purpose of celebrating several landmarks throughout the Kingdom of Hungary. Most notably Hunyad Castle, which is located in Transylvania. Now at this point you may be thinking that Transylvania is in Romania, so surely there must be an error in the script here. However, that has not always been the case, and in fact the region was part of Hungary rather than Romania, which all changed following the fallout of World War I. To make matters more complicated over the course of time, Transylvania has been dominated by several different peoples and countries throughout its confusing history, thus meaning Vajunjad Castle, a location that helps define Hungary's confusing history, is the perfect setting to tell today's tale from. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the confusing history of Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge, the second entry in the Darkstalkers series. Yeah! For those who have been living under a rock, the easiest way to explain what Darkstalkers is that it is basically to Street Fighter what Futurama is to The Simpsons. Back in 1994, Capcom were keen to build on the popularity of the gameplay they presented players with in Street Fighter 2. By offering consumers a game featuring very similar gameplay with a whole cast of new characters and new aesthetics. Like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which came out the same year, Darkstalkers was released for the Capcom System 2 arcade board. Like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the game featured special meters similar to the Super Combo gauges, and it was even the first Capcom game to ever feature air blocking and crouch walking, mechanics that would become staples of most Capcom games down the line. The game in many ways was silently revolutionary. According to Murata, who worked on Darkstalkers, he mentioned that most fighting games of the period simply copied the Street Fighter formula to such a degree that all their character rosters simply focused on stereotypical fighters from different countries, whereas the Darkstalkers lineup was designed to make players curious about each fighter beyond what they could see on screen, giving a lot of character depth to this monster-themed fighting game. The game was critically well received and had enough charm to stand out against all of its fighting game contemporaries, which would result in this arcade classic receiving a sequel as quickly as the following year of 1995. Now, the first thing that is confusing about the Darkstalkers series is the game's names. Nothing is chronologically simple with this series. Games have different names in different regions, and Darkstalkers 3 is not even the third entry in the fricking series. But that is a game to discuss in a future upload. The first game released was known as Vampire the Night Warrior in Japan, whereas the title would be marketed as Darkstalkers the Night Warriors around the rest of the world. The game's sequel, that released in 1995, would be known as Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge in most regions. However, in Japan it would be known as Vampire Hunter Darkstalkers Revenge, which without context sounds a bit strange for a title that lets players play as vampires and other monsters, but we'll make sense of this shortly. If you were to play both Darkstalkers the Night Warriors and the second game in the franchise, Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge, back to back, you would note that classifying this game as a full-blown sequel to the original would probably be a tad generous, as the game seems more like an updated reiteration of the original rather than a true successor. At its heart, the game features very similar mechanics to the original, features all of the original fighters and all of the old game's stage backdrops. However, some changes have been made to the combat and a few new characters and stages have been added as well. The game is basically the Super Street Fighter 2 of the Darkstalkers universe, Whilst both Darkstalkers games were made to run on the CPS2 hardware, it is still of note though that the original Darkstalkers used 128 megabits for all characters, whilst Revenge uses 256 for the characters. All in all, meaning there is an average of 500 extra patterns for each character. Wow. Despite this though, the game still features the exact same plot and endings found in the previous game for each playable character who appeared in the original, so there is a lot of content that has been recycled here. Some of it's typical greedy Capcom really. In terms of further changes to this 2D competitive fighting game, chain combos are introduced and players have the option to use the gameplay mode found in the original or switch to an option that allows for auto blocking. Players now also have the ability to stock up on their special gauges, allowing players to store more than one full bar. The game also contains two kinds of super moves which can be executed with the aid of the special gauge. These include huge ES specials which can be performed by only using a portion of the gauge, or huge EX specials which use the entire stock of the gauge. The game also contains rearranged music to that of which was found in the original, along with a few new tracks too. The most notable change to the game though is of course the game's new playable characters and stage backdrops that accompany them. The game contains 4 fighters who were not previously controllable in the last game. The first of these are brand spanking new to the franchise, in the form of Donovan Bane and Hoising Ko, which I'm probably not pronouncing right at all. Story-wise, both of these characters hunt Darkstalkers, which is where the game gets its vampire hunter name from in Japan, thus answering that question. Neither of these characters are entirely human themselves, so let's discuss exactly who they are. Donovan is a Dhampir, basically a human-vampire hybrid. He went through a dramatic event as a child where the vampire inside him awakened, causing him to kill everyone in his village, even his mother. Disgusted with himself, he devoted his life to Buddhism, justice and peace. As an adult, he discovered a child named Anita, cursed with the same supernatural powers as himself. In an attempt to save her soul, he set off with her to hunt all the Darkstalkers in the world who attack the innocent, leading to his appearance in this game. As I mentioned last time I covered Darkstalkers on here, the characters are often based on various myths and lore from around the world, and Donovan is no different. Dhampirs play a huge role in folklore from the Balkans, and were usually created as a result of unions between male vampires and female humans mating. In real life, many women would even try to blame their pregnancies on vampires, and there were even cases of Serbian men pretending to be vampires in order to reach the women they desired. As for the second character, Hoising Ko is based off of Asian folklore rather than European. She is a hopping vampire from Chinese mythology. According to this folklore, this is caused by demonic possession of a person, causing them to gain a dark appearance. They have physical bodies, but they are not alive, nor have will or thought. Basically, they are closer to a Haitian zombie rather than anything from Western lore. In Hoising Ko's case, her along with her sister, Mai Ling, were twin girls born in a village. Both of them were raised to be martial artists. On a ceremonial night, when they were 16 years old, their village and people were attacked by a group of supernatural beings known as Darkstalkers. Their mother gave her life to protect them, but trapped her own soul in darkness in the process. To release their mother, Hoising Ko uses the Igyo tension technique to turn into a Jiangshi, aka a Chinese hopping vampire. Mai Ling, her older sister, turns into a ward to make sure Hoising Ko doesn't lose control of her darker half, and the two set off to hunt down Darkstalkers, thus introducing Hoising to the game's roster. The game includes the same end bosses as the original game, in the form of Huitzil and Pyron. However, now both fighters are accessible to players from the player select screen, meaning the title has a selection of 14 different fighters to choose from. Whilst this game was originally released in the arcades, the title would make it into people's homes, which is where the game's history becomes a little more confusing. In a strange twist, Darkstalkers Revenge would actually be the first Darkstalkers game to make it to home systems, with the original game receiving a release too, but at a later date. In regards to Darkstalkers Revenge, the game would be fantastically ported to the Sega Saturn in Japan in December of 1995. With the Sega Saturn's powerful 2D capabilities delivering an almost arcade perfect experience for gamers. In fact, you could even argue a case for the Saturn version of this game being even better, as something known as an appendix mode was added, which allowed players to customise the game's backgrounds, the opponent's colours, and even the background music between music found in Darkstalkers Revenge for the arcade and the music found in the Saturn version. The fact that the game was released on the Sega Saturn and not the PlayStation was met with outrage from PlayStation owners at the time, with consumers seemingly not realising that the PlayStation had inferior hardware when it came to developing games featuring 2D sprites. In an explanation for the decision to not bring the game over to the Sony PlayStation in December of 1995, Capcom representatives said, "The reason is the problems we had converting the PlayStation version, which we didn't have with the Saturn. Originally the plan was to release a PlayStation version of Darkstalkers in April, but it fell behind, hence the decision to take the later Vampire Hunter straight to the Saturn." So, I could be wrong here, but it seems that originally Capcom intended to release the original game on both pieces of hardware, but had so much trouble with the PlayStation that instead they put the project on the back burner and focused all of their efforts on porting the second game over to the powerful Saturn instead, which is why the second game in the series was the first to make it to home consoles. Still though, the older original game would eventually make it to the PlayStation, but not until April of 1996. So in regards to the game's confusing home release history, it's all basically down to the PlayStation being a bit crap, and Sony designing their hardware due to a demand from gamers wanting to masturbate over ugly polygons rather than beautiful 2D refined sprites. Ooh. Going back to the release of this game in the arcades, in April of 1995 the publication known as Game Machine referred to the title as the second most successful arcade game of the year, listing it only behind Street Fighter Alpha. Next Generation would note the game's dramatic graphical improvements over the original and added the new special move system adds a strategic element to the game and saves it from being a mere remake of the original, concluding that Night Warriors doesn't break new ground, but the bottom line here is that it is done really well. Now, I have already mentioned that the Saturn version of the game was handled very well too. The publication, simply known as Video Games, refers to it as a must purchase for fight fans and Saturn owners. GameFan called it one of Capcom's best fighters to date, with quite possibly the best animation on a home fighting game yet, describing it as an amazing translation and a big improvement over X-Men, and a Saturn exclusive you must own. Electronic Gaming Monthly described it as a near perfect translation, and Sega Saturn magazine simply called it practically arcade perfect, with both publishers praising the title for its variety of characters. When looking at the Saturn version, Next Generation remarked that the game successfully differentiates itself from other Capcom 2D fighters, with its macabre character designs and their appropriate movesets. What's fun about Night Warriors is the fact that anything can happen. The success of the series lies in the fact that each character has a host of twisted manoeuvres that take the action to all sorts of extremes, and yet that wonderful chess-like strategy element is still perfectly applicable to the game. So, all in all, as you have probably seen from this video, Darkstalkers Revenge is a decent title that did just enough to differentiate the game from the original Darkstalkers. Whilst we have now covered the first two Darkstalkers games, what may come as a surprise to you is that outside of compilations, there are still a total of another 4 different games from the Darkstalkers franchise, including console exclusives, arcade exclusives, and entries that even only came out in certain regions. Darkstalkers certainly has a history more confusing than most, but I hope it did an adequate job of explaining the second entry's place in history for you. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was a story of yet another classic fighting game. Let me know in the comment section which other fighting games you would be keen for me to cover, and if you're interested in me making further Darkstalkers content, I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts down below. Finally, today's subject was chosen by the wonderful people who back this channel on Patreon. I try to produce content appealing to those who get the most enjoyment out of what I do. If you want early access to every video I produce, want even more of a say over the videos I upload, and want a production credit to call your own, you can receive all sorts of rewards and incentives for backing this channel for as little as $1 a month or more, over on Patreon. Huge thank yous and shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, Hero Paula Lopez, Joseph Razmik, Doug Perkins, Rowan Dinch, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Camber Rambo 82, A Murder of Crows, Azrael Rarakai, Keith Ferguson, Joaquin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, SpongeMatt B, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Instant Gratification, Monkey, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Bubba Kitty, Ron Stud, Chesty LaRue, Langston Miller, Noob, Casey Wright, Zai, Brian Barry, Selagny, Chris Margarine, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Vlaming Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Punky Dooster, Matthew Windle, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Marco Soto, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Jesse Tay, Crazy Yao, Master Jinx, Hans Christian, Time Lord Soundwave, Dan Van Dam, Adam Casting, Gregory Smoragewitz, Rick67, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bull, Angry Little SOB, Mike Bruno, Anders Reinsbergs, Chris Fisk, Ivan M, Paul Elliott, Me Machine Dean, Antonio Rodriguez, Dan Barlow Jr., Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroverse.com, Synth Spaces, and Andrew Byzanski. Thank you so much to every single one of my patrons and every single one of my viewers who continue to watch this show week in and week out. I love you all a lot, as you probably know. Cheerio.